Hi, this is Mrs. Baranyk, and I'm going to run through the different historical developments that led to the Enlightenment, a massive change in the way some people thought that changed the world. We have to start in Greece during the classical era. In the 5th century BCE, Athens became a center of philosophy and education. Philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle taught others and tried to figure out the world. They weren't convinced that things happened without reason or because of the whims of the gods. They used logic and reason to figure out their world. Empirical evidence is evidence that can be observed. It's what you do in your science labs when you experiment and record what you see. They were using science to figure out how the natural world worked and even to consider human behavior. 2,000 years later, the same way of viewing the world became the new way of seeing the world in the Enlightenment. But if it was there 2,000 years before, why was it new? Well, remember that after the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe went into the Dark Ages, where for a time the focus was on survival. Education took a back seat unless you were a member of the clergy, which is somebody who works for the church. During this time period, the Catholic Church was sending missionaries all over Europe to try to convert those who were polytheistic to Christianity. This successful effort led to Christianity becoming the glue that united Europe. In a time when Europe was decentralized, being a Christian became the identity that bonded people. In this time period of intense religious belief, theological or religious explanations were dominant. There were still philosophers, but they were trying to fit their notion of the world into what they knew from the Bible. Don't get me wrong, there were people doing science the way that we know it, but they weren't the dominant force. Most things were attributed to God or God's wrath, like the Black Plague. Around the year 1000, you might remember that Europeans started to reconnect with the Muslim world. From these connections and connections with the Byzantine Empire, the works of the ancient philosophers rooted in logic and rationalism started to make their way back into Western Europe. While most people weren't reading these, some people were. And as the economy and weather improved, there was a renewed interest in education. Universities opened and humanist scholars started to consider that there were explanations for the natural and human world that could be figured out. They started to consider the achievements of individuals and to look for rational and secular explanations for why things happened. In this time period, the scientific revolution began. Early scientists like Copernicus used math to figure out that the sun was the center of the solar system, which is not what most people thought. After all, the idea that the Earth was spinning and whipping through space seemed illogical. I'm going to segue here and explain something called epistemology to you. Epistemology is the study of how we know what we know. During the post-classical era in Europe, people trusted their senses, what they could see, feel, experience, and sources of authority like the church to tell them what was true. If this is the way you think, then when you see the sun rise and set, it's clear that it is moving and not the earth. You also don't feel yourself spinning around the sun, so we must not be. Additionally, there were passages in the Bible that seemed to indicate that the earth didn't move. For instance, there was one passage that talked about the sun standing still at Jericho. Well, to stand still, it must move. The church taught that the earth was in a fixed position and God's throne was above it. So all of these things led people to the belief that the earth was the center of the solar system. The way people knew what was true started to change. 16th century Polish philosopher Copernicus was a good Catholic. He was trying to work out the mathematical equations that would show how planets and the sun orbited around the earth, but the math was messy and inelegant. When he placed the sun at the center, the math became simpler and clearer. He used logic and rational thinking. He wanted evidence to prove the truth to him. And that's what we would consider modern epistemology. We don't just trust something because an authority states it. We want facts and evidence. Copernicus's works were not published until after he died because he didn't want to contradict the church. It could be dangerous to do that. Remember, this is also the time of the Reformation, and the church had launched the Inquisition to root out heresy, which are beliefs that go against traditional Christian doctrine. As it happened, the church wasn't overly concerned with his work because it was published in Latin, which only scholars and some clergy could understand, and it was too complicated for your average person. But in the 17th century, Italian scientist Galileo Galilei promoted Copernicus's work and added in empirical observations that contradicted the church's teachings and sometimes made fun of them. The books he wrote were brought to the attention of the Inquisition in 1615, and he was put on trial. He was found guilty and sentenced to house arrest, but it was too late to silence him. His works had been widely read. Scientists continued to use empirical approaches to understanding the world, and by the 18th century, Isaac Newton was figuring out the laws that governed the physical world, like the laws of motion and gravity. And he was a major inspiration for Enlightenment philosophers. Once they realized that the physical world was knowable and understandable, they started to look at the world of humans and wonder if there were laws that should be universal and governing all men to create the most ideal world. 18th century poet Alexander Pope wrote of Newton, "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." We're going to switch gears here because the Enlightenment wasn't just based on what was happening in the scientific and philosophical world. Politics were equally important. Remember, the early modern era was a time where kings all over the world were consolidating their power. They were pushing back the power of the aristocracy and claiming more of it for themselves. Many in Europe claimed to rule by divine right, and they were building global empires. In this time, the individual rights of a person were less important than the power of the state, and people felt that acutely. Being powerless can make people feel awful. How can you be in control of your own destiny if you don't have a say in the powers that govern it? This, plus the idea that there might be universal laws that govern mankind, started to give rise to new ways of thinking about government. Thomas Hobbes was an English philosopher of the 17th century. In his work, The Leviathan, he wrote that kings didn't get their powers from God. They got their power from the people. It was the people agreeing to follow them and to obey royal rules that empowered kings. If you look closely at the cover of the book, which you can see on the screen, you'll see that the king's body is made up of individual people. If the people simply stopped following or listening to the king, he'd be powerless. This was a pretty new concept in the time of divine right monarchy. However, Hobbes was not advocating revolution. As a matter of fact, the idea of a lawless state terrified him. Hobbes wrote that without the power of a king to control society, the life of man would be nasty, brutish, and short. He described a world where no one innovated or started a business because they could not be guaranteed the right to keep it. It was a world where might or strength made right or gave people the power to do whatever they wanted. Hobbes had a notion of something that would come to be called the social contract. It's essentially the idea that the people in the government are in a deal, a contract with each other, which is why people allow kings to rule them. The government promises to protect people and their property, and the people promise to follow the laws and pay their taxes. If they don't, they can go to jail and even lose their lives. But in Hobbes's conception of the social contract, the king could not be punished for failing to uphold his end of the deal because of that fear of lawlessness. Then, in the 17th century, about a generation after Hobbes, something happened to test that theory. See, England had an interesting political history that was watched and studied by political philosophers. In the 13th century, the British nobility forced the king to sign a social contract called the Magna Carta, or the Great Charter. It limited the rights of the king by laying out certain things he could or could not do. This established some rights for the people. One that might sound familiar to you is the idea of trial by jury. England also had a parliament or governing body of the people that grew more powerful over time, sharing some power with the king, although the king had the power to shut down parliament. In the 17th century, there were major conflicts between the king and parliament. Partially this was due to religious tensions brought about by the Reformation, but it was also because the kings of England believed in the theory of divine right monarchy and resented having to go to parliament to request things like taxes. Eventually, this erupted into the English Civil War that ended with the beheading of the king, which you can imagine was shocking to other divine right monarchs in Europe. There was a short rule by Oliver Cromwell, who had been a member of Parliament, and he quickly became a dictator who nobody liked, and then England went back to having kings. But the kings went back to challenging the power of Parliament. So in the late 17th century, the English had Civil War Part 2. This one was called the Glorious Revolution, glorious because the king fled instead of being killed. And Parliament invited a new king and queen to take the throne, but they had to agree to a new social contract, the English Bill of Rights. This greatly restricted the power of the king and queen and put a lot more power into the hands of Parliament. It was the first modern Bill of Rights. English philosopher John Locke lived through the Glorious Revolution, well, at a distance because he left the country, but it was during this time that he wrote his 2 treatises of government which laid out a new social contract. Remember the social contract of Hobbes? This looks a lot like it, but if the government fails to protect the life, liberty, and property of the citizens, then the citizens have the right to take the government down and create a new one, like the English had with the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. These were the ideas that influenced Thomas Jefferson in America, who wrote the Declaration of Independence. When you read that document, you will hear echoes of John Locke. This was the true beginnings of political philosophy. Many other philosophers in France and Scotland were inspired by the English government and started to imagine a new world where people were not powerless, where they were citizens instead of subjects. Political philosophers of the Enlightenment looked at the governments of the classical era like democracy from ancient Greece and republican government from ancient Rome, where people chose representatives. They looked at the power of the church in the Middle Ages and started to ask what the role of religion should be in public life. From the Renaissance, they drew on that humanistic approach to the world, reviving the importance of education and the notion that humans could figure out their world. The scientific revolution saw the laws of the universe figured out and led philosophers to consider government and the idea that perhaps there were natural laws that should govern all men and that they could be revealed. And then during the English Civil War, people started to ask, how much power should a king have? Who should be more powerful? Should it be the people or the king or the government? Where does the king get his power from? What rights should the people have? And all of that is leading us straight to these new philosophies of the Enlightenment and eventually the revolutions that they inspired.